So what I want to say then, since the 1930s, as modern marketing progressed somewhere along the line, across a very important line, moving from advertising, or just advertising, to propaganda for a materialistic ideology and for corporate capitalism itself. So the way that modern marketing is functioning these days is way past advertising. It has meta messages that are, in some ways, I think, even more important and more devastating than the specific messages, which we talk about endlessly here, and which I think very much we need to fight. But I want to turn our attention somewhat now to the meta messages. One such meta message, and this is one that's been talked about pretty frequently, is the one that the way to happiness is to have enough stuff, right? The materialistic meta message, the materialistic values that cut across all marketing, and even marketing for what we might think of as good products. Doesn't matter. The message is that you can buy your way to happiness. So we're pretty familiar with this, and there's a lot of research, and Tim Katzler, I don't know where Tim is, has done some of the key research here showing that the more materialistic more materialistic you are, the worse off you are in all kinds of ways. You're more depressed and anxious, and just basically functioning less well. And Julie Shore, who talked yesterday, has even done some research saying that there's a causal effect that goes in this direction. It's not just correlational. But the corporations, for several decades, have gone beyond this materialistic message through branding. And again, as you know, what branding is all about is the idea that who makes the product, or the company that makes the product, is as or more important than the product itself. So the solution, just do it, is branding for Nike, and the fact that Nike makes it often matters more than whatever it is that they make. What is the meta message of branding that cuts across all branding? Well, what it is that corporations are necessary for your happiness. Corporations and their products are what it is that's going to make life wonderful. And this is what our kids are growing up with, this meta message. I call it corporate materialism. So it's not just any old sneaker. It's Nike. And children grow up with the sense that if Nike were to disappear, it would be a tremendous loss. Right? That if all of these multinational corporations that are making these incredible products were to be dismantled, they couldn't be happy. And I've talked to high school students from Berkeley and asked them to try to imagine what the world would be like without corporations. And the first thing that happens is they can't do it. They just can't go there. And they find the question a little weird, but they'll go, they go along with me, and they'll try. One young man said to me, well, we'd still kind of buy what the popular kids buy, so I don't think much would change. So to be fair, this was in Berkeley, right? So this, there were some kids who really hate the advertising, but they really had a hard time just imagining a world where they weren't inundated with it. And so that's a loss right there of imagination. So the meta messages even bring us to the point where the sense of the future has been narrowed, so that it's inevitable and desirable that we're going to go to a global economy, and that utopia is going to be that we all own the same products together. And this is also another meta image, if you will, that we see in marketing, this sense that the whole world is coming together around corporate products. And that, of course, is the fantasy of globalization, of economic globalization. I'm not saying that this is necessarily being done on purpose by the marketers. It might be by some of them, I wouldn't put it past them. But what is happening is that the marketing is coming out of a corporate culture that fiercely believes in this fantasy. And therefore, the images that it creates are going to reflect this. It shouldn't be a surprise to us that this is happening. People have called this the monoculture, or the materialistic monoculture, and at the center of it are corporate products. That's utopia. Now, those of us who fight this are called utopian all the time, so I find that amusing. So, how is this propaganda? I guess that's the next step. Well, we understand easily one part of this. I mean, propaganda shares with advertising that it's repetitive, it's ubiquitous, it's informed by sophisticated psychological manipulations. And in terms of the meta messages I've just been saying, it's about values and beliefs and ideology. So that part, of course, it's just like propaganda. And actually, if you've ever seen a sponsored educational material that the schools send, have any of you actually seen some of these? It's like propaganda. I mean, there's these happy workers for the coal industry, you know, internationally, on international freighters, and there's the music swelling, and just, it could have been from the Soviet Union. I mean, it really looks like propaganda. But I don't think it's usually quite so overt. There's another piece of this that the way modern marketing has become propaganda for corporate ideology that I don't think is quite so obvious, and it's described by Herman and Chomsky in Manufacturing Consent, which is a wonderful book if you haven't read it. And they talk about how propaganda in non-authoritarian countries such as the United States is actually structured into the media in such a way that it's invisible but very powerful. An example of that is that because it's so expensive to own media and to run media organizations, only the very rich can be owners, and there's a conservative bias built into the system that way. If we had another way of owning media with other kinds of people running the organizations, then we would have a very different, well, either bias or we'd have more diversity, for sure. And here's another structural one that I think is pertinent to our discussion. This one I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but it's the fact that editors and reporters refrain from covering stories that reflect badly on their sponsors, a practice that becomes internalized and is only visible when transgressions occur. At that point, the stories are pulled, and the offending reporters, if they don't go along, are fired. Although the real reason for the firing is covered up by a trumped-up excuse. So this process of advertising, not allowing other points of view into the mainstream media, so that the alternative media is the one that's always trying to barge into the conversation as best we can. That's a structural problem of advertising, which makes it like propaganda, because propaganda doesn't allow controversial or dissenting points of view. It inundates you with its, and nothing else is allowed. And this is how our marketing is now functioning. Adbusters magazine has been trying for years to get a public service announcement, which is not an advertising. Public service announcements are not advertisements. They're not trying to sell something for profit. Don't let people confuse you by treating them equally, which the industry likes to do too. Anyway, they put out a public service announcement critical of consumerism, and none of the networks and none of the major cable television networks will play it. And